This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Do you know that ASA has a journal, an academic journal closely associated with the organisation? That journal is called Animal Studies Journal. It's published by the chair of ASA, which is Melissa Boyd, coming out of the University of Wollongong. So while you're checking out ASA, you should also check out ASA's journal, the Animal Studies Journal. And in fact, our guest today has published recently an Animal Studies Journal, and that's the paper we're going to focus on. So check out both ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association, and Animal Studies Journal. And while you're checking things out, make sure you go to the Animal Publics website. They've got a beautiful new website. Animal Publics is part of the University of Sydney Press, and I'm actually at the University of Sydney at the moment. So it's all coming together. It's very, very zen. So go and have a look at Animal Publics. They are doing wonderful work providing a publishing house, a publishing locale for animal studies scholars. They've already got quite a few beautiful books published. And I know of quite a few really nice new books that are going to be coming out this year, 2020. So keep an eye on the Animal Publics website. And if you're looking for somewhere to, if someone at your institution says, let's buy a whole lot of animal studies books, where should we look? Tell them to go and check out Animal Publics. Okay. Well, it's a beautiful, beautiful, warm, sunny day. And once again, I'm at the University of Sydney. Indeed, I'm in the building that I was studying in as a PhD student. So it's a very, very kind of overwhelmingly nice feelings, I have to say, being here. I guess your PhD is like a lot of other things. You forget the difficult bits after a certain amount of time has passed. And I'm really pleased this week to be joined by Elisabeth Valiente-Riedl. This is where I realised that I don't know how to speak. What have I done that well?
You've done that, yes, Valiente-Riedl, but it's a tongue twister for everybody.
Well, Elisabeth is an interdisciplinary lecturer at the University of Sydney, and today we're going to discuss her recent journal article towards a multispecies solidarity, individual stories of learning to consume ethically, and it was published in Animal Studies Journal in 2019, the journal I just mentioned. Welcome to the podcast, Elisabeth.
Thank you very much. And I also did my PhD in this building.
Oh, really?
There you go.
Wonderful. So, Elisabeth, why this work? What led you to this?
I would say I'm starting to really think that a lot of my research is experiential, in that it's intrinsically motivated by the dilemmas I face in everyday life, also the ones that I observe others facing. So, back to that PhD when I was doing research on fair trade, sort of at the turn of the millennium, when that was the coffee crisis and that was a huge issue, and I was looking at that in the context of developing country growers and whether fair trade would offer any support for them. But fundamentally, it was actually motivated by, what impact do I have as a consumer? What responsibility do I have as a consumer? So it was hidden beneath that agenda was something much more phenomenological as well. Seeing how the decisions and actions we make really impact others, and that how fundamental those relationships are. So this piece of research really links to that, but observing as well over years of researching ethical consumption, how diverse that space is, how conflicted that space is, how you can be talking about animal rights, environmental protection, political solidarity, all these very different things and different toolkits, and really wanting to explore that further through looking at the lived experience of people that identify with that.
Wonderful. So you use quite an interesting method in your research. It's focused around 3 women. Can you tell us about your women, beg your pardon, your method, and also a little bit about the 3 women that you study for this paper?
So I sought to meet people who self-identified as ethical consumers. And so this wasn't actually initially specifically about animal rights, or, it was just an open-ended offering to talk to people who self-identify as ethical, and these were the women that responded, and actually all on campus, though quite different. The approach was to, and this is actually where I'm spreading my wings methodologically. I've done qualitative research before, but nothing this deeply qualitative. So I started with a narrative interview, and literally, kudos to them for being brave in that context, sitting down, having an initial introduction, and then asking, what was your journey to ethical consumption? And, they would speak uninterrupted. And some of them spoke for half an hour, and I'd follow up with a few questions. And so that was really lovely. I also had the opportunity to go on a follow-up shopping trip with them, because I wanted to see firsthand what shopping looked like for them in the context of their ethical principles and thinking, but also whether there were challenges in that experience. And we did a follow-up interview there as well. And that was just really revealing, across those methods, because my understanding of their journey and the challenges they faced changed in that way. I had one student who was post-PhD and a vegan, and another student who was doing her honours year, a vegan as well, and a third student who was an international student, very pro-animal rights, but also had a young child. And their stories were very different. Their shopping experiences were very different, and it just reveals the diversity that you contend with as a consumer, but also that, academics wanting to understand this space, or advocates wanting to understand this space, need to confront as well. If we look at the differences in those methods with one of the students who's an international student, her relationship with her daughter was really critical to thinking through what her ethical baseline was, what her capacity to act according to her principles was. Very committed to animal rights, wants to pursue that vocationally as well through a veterinary degree. But when it comes to shopping, she has to keep an eye on the bottom line. So she took me to a major mall. We would go, start at one place where there was a bargain bin of, I guess, fruits and vegetables that were borderline, heavily plastic wrapped and styrofoamed. But she would buy those because, she'd fill up with that first and then go from shop to shop to shop to get the cheapest options. And she, for her, if I push beyond what I can afford financially, then I will, have a financial burden and a stress that will not be healthy for my child. She would still try to mediate that impact by, repurposing the products she had, but that just really highlighted that it's not that simple to have principles. You actually need to be enabled and empowered to act on those. So that was really revealing for me, and I don't think I wouldn't have seen that if I hadn't gone shopping with her. Because, if I thought to ask the right question, maybe, but I wouldn't have. Another case, she is a dumpster diver, so we didn't actually end up going any shopping together, but we talked about that as well. And the third talked, and it's actually hard for me to talk about them with the names in the article because those are pseudonyms, but goes to health food shops as well. Yeah. Each of them, what's really interesting as well is it was just really, their evolution in there, and I got to speak to them sort of for the first time. The space between our talking points was about 6 months. They were so influenced by their families. They that there were visible changes or big changes in their consumption habits if they moved from home or moved back to home. You could see instances of them negotiating what was purchased, but often influencing others just through modelling to start purchasing differently. And, with one of the participants as well, she was newly in a relationship when I met her the second time. And there were very live conversations about ethical consumption, also in the sense of, she described an example where they wanted to go somewhere and she had to go by bicycle in terms of her standards. He went by car and they would meet at the end. So, this was a whole new world of the thing that I had not understood going into that piece of research, and some people will slam me for only having, 3 participants, was how important relational negotiation is. Yeah.
Wonderful. So what I'm hearing from you then is that this concept of ethical consumption is a very, very broad umbrella term that if we deploy the concept or deploy the expression, it can't be immediately clear to the person we're speaking to what we mean, what they think of. Were there some parallels or some kind of defining characteristics that you can point to, or is it really just about trying to do your best and being mindful within the context you find yourself in?
And mindful is an interesting word because that was one that I was thinking about, mindful consumption. And, solidarity obviously is a linchpin in this article, partly because I think, in those earlier days of fair trade where it was very much about political solidarity, we've moved away from that largely. I think what's important in this research and where multi-species solidarity and some of the emerging and new literature in the animal sort of rights and pro-animal space produces is this emphasis on process and this emphasis on how we articulate in the world in relation to others. That, is in relation to other non-human animals, but also other life forms. And that's not consistently looked at in parts of the literature. But I think what's also important and what I'm wanting to tease out or look at more in further work is how we relate to ourselves as part of relating to others. Because in navigating relationships with non-human animals and other life forms, there was a need to empathetically partner with other important humans, to influence each other as a way to navigate toward that. Because those relationships in that context is so essential to how we are liberated to identify and act according to our ethical principles. And also that it's an ongoing journey, yeah? Because at the moment in the ethical consumption literature, in pieces of it, you can just be caught, you can be stuck with, well, there's conflicting ethical baselines. You can, in political solidarity with a coffee grower in Tanzania, you're then running up against the carbon miles of bringing that coffee to Australia. So those are competing ethical baselines. So if we look at just that sort of output focus, then I guess there's, then we can look at a really frazzled and non-cohesive space, which is more cohesive if you look at little pockets within it. But I think what this broader framework allows is to look at how we're trying to navigate as a process, our own identity in relation to others. And that process takes time. Yeah.
It's interesting in the current environment in which veganism is becoming very popular and almost mainstream, certainly a recognisable concept. Then there's also these challenges that then we have, corporations who perhaps vegans traditionally wouldn't have supported bringing on board vegan products that then mean that you have to start asking questions about where you want your dollars to go, et cetera, et cetera. Did you find that one of the criticisms that's made of kind of emerging vegans is that they're perhaps not political. Did you find that these people were vegan and other things? Was that important to them? Or, how did they mix their veganism perhaps with other values?
Well, that was one of the reasons I wanted to understand. I have a little, we have our little hypotheses or our questions about what these phenomena are about. And part of me wonders, there is that corporate greenwashing phenomenon that there's concern about in the ethical space, the concern about ethics light and are we just subscribing to veganism because it's hip and pop? But there's also, and this is, the opportunity cost potentially of not standing with our banners. Are we, is the ethical consumption that we're pursuing, yes, important, but it is also sort of dulling our motivation to act and advocate in other more powerful spaces or more powerful ways. And I did find that there wasn't a huge politicization, and I can't say half the words I need to write myself, of what was happening actually. There was sort of a more political interest from one participant, but even so, there wasn't a huge sense of community, though for some of them I think they were still sort of starting to find that. Certainly when my participant, who'd initially, when I first met her, had thought about dumpster diving and ended up dumpster diving, at that point she felt like she was more of a part of community. So yeah, you could be looking for community, and that was still a little bit limited, but certainly in terms of political identity, endeavour, ambition, that didn't seem to be quite there. And I mean, that's one of my questions about ethical consumption more broadly, is how the extent to which it allows participants to feel part of a community, let alone to channel some of their beliefs into advocacy in certain ways. But there was certainly a growth of understanding as well, I think. And, someone who, one participant said at the beginning, I didn't really think about animal rights. It was more about the environmental thing, but more and more I cared about that. So as they come into contact with these products, networks, values, they learn more and more through others that they are in contact with, as well as through the information that, those experiences provide them. So there's a learning that was definitely in play. But, whether consumption itself remains an individualizing force that inhibits something more political happening, I mean, that's something I'd like to find out through more individual stories.
Wonderful. Well, hopefully we get to learn more about your research in coming years as you undertake more.
Yes.
Now, Elisabeth, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I'm ready.
Okay. Now, I'm not 100% sure if you really identify as an animal studies scholar or partially an animal studies scholar, but we can adapt the questions anyway. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
That has been more recently, and as part of my learning through this article. So, 2, I've read some of Eduardo Cohn's How Forests Think, which is sort of a big blueprint on multi-species ethnography. Also Alan Smart, who also writes on multi-species ethnography. But probably that one first, and I think that was sort of a broadening of, who is the subject in this piece, and that we're actually looking at broader relationships, that ethical consumption is about relationships. And
Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
This one, and it was accidental because I started with a broader question about ethical consumption, and because of my participants and the stories that emerged, it became clear whether, they were strongly pro-animal themselves or, some of them were more focused on life forms and so fit with the sort of the ethnographical approach that encompasses life forms beyond non-human animals. But all of them, I think, were moving more toward that. And as I saw that negotiation of relationships with other humans and other non-human animals, that this literature really sort of stood up.
This isn't one of the official 5 quick questions, but do you think you'll write more in this space?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And actually the journal has been really helpful. The editors and the reviewers have been really good at pointing me to some other resources, which I'll, that have really shown me that there's a whole literature that either is directly relevant to this or that, really could be adapted to this space. And actually, I should say, in terms of the first pro-animal literature that I read, well, I've probably, I've read in the last 10 years research that's relevant to this, that has called it something by another name, or that has looked at a piece of that, or, in parts of it, engaged with this. But to see how it's handled in this pocket, I think it could actually be more relevant to this other broader ethical consumption literature, and we could learn a lot.
Wonderful. Okay, back to the official 5 quick questions. Yeah. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Other than some colleagues in sociology at the University of Sydney, Dinesh Radhuel and Danielle Sellermeyer, there's some great scholars here that do great work. Kendra Coulter, her book on animals' work and the promise of interspecies solidarity. And she focused a lot more on relationships with animals through work. And I just kept reflecting on how we actually, create relationships with animals through consumption. And I'd love to pick her brain about what she thinks about that and how her concept extends into that space.
Wonderful. Have to get her on the show.
Yeah.
What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Continue to research and explore, I think, the relationships we're all enmeshed in, and make those visible and richer, make our understandings of those richer. I can't pinpoint anything specific because I just am such, I'm a learner, and I don't find any piece of research sort of ticks that box and makes anything clearer for me. Yeah, in terms of sort of fast, easy ways forward. But I think we need to continue to throw a light on this.
Absolutely. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
To build more mindfulness, empathy between humans and non-humans, and to extend people's sense of where their networks and their world begins and ends. And I suppose it was a little cheeky second to just lift away some of these structural constraints that complicate how we can be in the world as well. Because I think for those that are trying to enrich, minimize their impact or enrich their impact in the world, there's a lot of structural barriers that sort of make that really difficult.
Absolutely. So what are you working on next?
Next is there's 2 sort of pieces that are going to happen. One is I want to go and take this study to LA, the City of Angels. So I want to understand in sort of the mega hub of all things consumption and also increasingly all things ethical, how deep that ethics goes and what the challenges of negotiating that are. But I also want to deepen the study here with some mixed methods work, maybe some surveying in complement with some of this qualitative work, and to get a hold of more people in their community contexts and within their relationships as well.
I believe veganism is very hot in LA at the moment, so I'm sure you'll find a lot of wonderful subjects to study there. So how can people find out more about your work?
they can look me up at the University of Sydney site and, read this new piece, but also really to read the other articles in this journal, because I think it's a really good collection. But yeah, that would be the main way.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, Elisabeth, thank you so much. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget, you can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals. You can follow me at SO_S. You can follow us at Facebook at Knowing Animals. And don't forget to leave a review. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.